The void ignited with a color that physics strictly forbade. Highbringer Kraxos gripped his obsidian throne as 12 invincible Kalan armadas stalled abruptly. A single vessel hovered before them in the deep silence of the Sol sector. Possessed absolutely zero weapon ports. Just pristine white plating, blinding cyan propulsion, and an impossible energy signature that cracked the flagship's heavy sensory dampeners. Kraxos expected a primitive dead zone, a world ripe for orbital burning. Instead, the dark space began to fracture along geometric lines. They thought humanity was weak. Wait until you see the trap we spent 3 centuries building. 72 standard hours earlier. Terminal Vertex groaned under the crushing weight of 10 billion subjugated souls. Heavy iron-wrought spires pierced the toxic sulfur smog of the massive hub world. Kraxos adjusted his bulky atmospheric regulators, deeply bored by the endless cycle of domination. Disobedience meant immediate vaporization from orbital platforms. Daily quotas strictly dictated biological lifespans for the lesser castes. Today, however, a strange, unregistered anomaly had docked at the primary spire. It wasn't a recognized warship. It was a tiny diplomatic courier, glowing with that same infuriating, unblemished cyan tech. Kraxos sneered at the visual feed on his command console. Lower species existed solely as fuel for the ascendancy engine. He intended to break these arrogant, soft-skinned newcomers before the next orbital rotation completed. Commander Jada Vance stepped from the heavy-pressure airlock. She wore a pristine high-tech white uniform. Jagged burn scars marked her jawline, contrasting sharply with the flawless synthetic fabric. Beside her stood Warrant Officer Jackson Cole. He casually cracked his knuckles, observing the hostile environment with calculating eyes. They were flanked by 3 hulking Kalan royal guards, each 9 feet of heavily armored malice. The humans didn't flinch. They walked confidently, like they owned the massive iron station. Kraxos felt a rare twitch of deep annoyance from his elevated podium. A millennium of uncontested rule had made him deeply intolerant of insolence. The grand hall smelled thickly of ozone and dried blood. Hundreds of armed Kalan warriors lined the perimeter of the vast room. Their heavy plasma rifles hummed with lethal readiness. The stakes were strictly personal for the human delegates. One wrong move meant absolute, immediate execution. Kraxos demanded Earth surrender its entire planetary population to the deep space labor pools. Vance stopped exactly 10 paces away from the towering obsidian throne. She did not bow. She did not offer a tribute of resources. Instead, she reached calmly into her uniform pocket. She retrieved a worn, primitive copper coin. She flipped it over her knuckles with practiced, rhythmic ease. The dull, metallic clink echoed sharply through the cavernous iron chamber. "We keep this crude metal to remember the cost of submission," Vance stated smoothly. "Earth seeks equals, not masters." Kraxos released a grinding stone laugh that shook the floor plates. Equals. The concept was biologically offensive to a superior Kalan warlord. He leaned forward heavily. His 4-jawed mandible clicked in dark, rumbling amusement. He slapped a heavy claw against a brass control panel. He activated the massive holoscreens lining the iron walls. The visual feeds displayed the deepest lower levels of the hazardous mining facility. Thousands of frail, bioluminescent Trellian laborers stood chained near the venting exhaust pipes. An adult Trellian, trembling violently, was shoved toward the precarious edge by a massive overseer. The frail creature had glowing blue veins that pulsed erratically under pale, translucent skin. He clutched a small, pathetic carving tool in his bound hands. He was just a gentle academic, a historian forced to haul highly radioactive raw uranium until his brittle bones splintered. Kraxos zoomed the primary feed directly onto the alien's terrified, glowing face. The stakes had escalated instantly. The lives of these innocents hung entirely on Vance's response. "Witness the reward for defiance," Kraxos mocked loudly. "Kneel, or I vaporize 1,000 workers for every second you remain standing." Vance watched the massive glowing screen intensely. Her steady pulse didn't elevate visibly. She didn't shout a desperate protest. Instead, She firmly caught the flying copper coin in her open palm. The heavy silence stretched painfully tight across the hall. The towering royal guards raised their heavy kinetic rifles. They aimed directly at the backs of the human delegates' knees. The thick tension threatened to physically crack the room. "Stop the broadcast," Vance ordered flatly. Her voice carried no panic. It held only a chilling, absolute mathematical certainty. Kraxos grinned widely, exposing multiple rows of jagged, serrated teeth. He raised a heavy claw to signal the distant overseer to begin the slaughter. He wanted to see the stoic humans finally break down. A predator only played with its prey until the game grew tedious. But Vance didn't break. She simply turned her head slightly to the left. Cole stopped cracking his knuckles. The massive station's atmospheric regulators hummed loudly in the heavy, stagnant air. Kraxos noticed the warrant officer wasn't looking at the guards' heavy plasma weapons. Cole was studying their complex armored knee joints. Or rather, he was calculating the exact kinetic torque required to snap them entirely backward. Vance slowly brushed a tiny speck of gray ash off her pristine white sleeve. "Jackson," she murmured softly. Cole moved violently. The Kalan elite possessed enhanced optical implants, capable of tracking incoming plasma fire in midair. They could not track Jackson Cole. He ducked smoothly beneath the closest guard's heavy rifle barrel. A localized kinetic burst from his right gauntlet shattered the giant's armored knee inward. The guard shrieked terribly, collapsing heavily under his own massive weight. Before the second soldier could pivot his bulky weapon, Cole jammed a small decryption spike directly into the alien's energy shield module. The resulting feedback loop detonated instantly. The concussive wave threw the massive Kalan against the far iron wall with a sickening crunch of bone. The third guard swung a deadly glowing vibroblade in a wide, desperate arc. Cole caught the descending wrist, twisted brutally, and concussed the beast with its own heavy hilt. Total elapsed time: 4.2 seconds. Kraxos roared furiously, surging up from his obsidian throne. "Slaughter them all," he bellowed. The heavy reinforcement garrison poured frantically into the hall from every adjacent corridor. They raised a solid wall of glowing plasma weapons. Vance casually tossed a small silver disc onto the grated floor. "We're leaving," she announced plainly. The sharp ozone tang of a massive localized EMP violently scrambled the station's grid. Absolute darkness slammed down instantly. Only the blinding cyan glow of Vance's high-tech collar remained visible in the heavy gloom. By the time the emergency crimson strobes flickered to life, the grand hall was completely empty. The humans had vanished cleanly into the labyrinth of the station vents. Alarms blared deafeningly across the entirety of Terminal Vertex. Kraxos paced the main command deck aggressively. His dark obsidian scales rattled with unprecedented, explosive fury. The tiny human diplomatic courier had blasted violently out of the main hangar, ignoring all defensive traffic protocols. It tore a clean, burning hole in the outer blockade and jumped seamlessly into slipspace. "Earth coordinates are securely logged," his fleet marshal hissed nervously, reviewing the final telemetry data. "Deploy the entire military armada," Kraxos commanded ruthlessly. "I want their home world reduced to molten glass. I want no survivors." He mobilized 12 invincible armadas without hesitation. Billions of heavily armed soldiers, thousands of massive capital ships, all surging aggressively toward the distant Sol sector. Kraxos intended to make a brutal, unforgettable example of Earth. He intended to broadcast their planetary destruction to every enslaved world currently suffering in the ascendancy. The existential threat to humanity was absolute and uncompromising. The deep slipspace jump took less than a full solar cycle. Kraxos stood confidently on the primary bridge of his flagship. He waited eagerly for the advanced visual sensors to render the doomed human homeworld. The distorted space outside the massive viewport crystallized sharply. The unstoppable Kalan armadas arrived in the quiet Sol sector. Kraxos leaned forward heavily in his command chair, anticipating a defenseless blue sphere ripe for orbital bombardment. The void ignited with a color that physics strictly forbade. The assumed dead zone was a total, elaborate illusion, It was a heavily cloaked staging ground of impossible, terrifying scale. The dark space fractured entirely, revealing hundreds of sleek, pristine white dreadnoughts. They didn't fire sloppy, inaccurate plasma arcs. They launched perfectly silent, cyan-glowing kinetic drills. These impossible weapons flawlessly predicted Kaelan evasive maneuvers before the thrusters even ignited. In agonizing slow motion, Kraxos watched his flagship's unbreachable armor peel away like wet paper. The horrible grinding sound of tearing metal vibrated intensely through his heavy boots. The glowing cyan death ripped cleanly through the hull in perfect, calculated silence. Out the shattered viewport, his invincible capital ships were detonating rapidly one by one. The human vessels moved with terrifying, synchronized hive-mind precision, slaughtering the armada. "You demanded a tribute," Vance's calm voice echoed clearly across the open fleet comms channel. "We brought a reckoning." The Kaelan command sensors screamed shrilly. Multiple massive warp signatures erupted simultaneously across the entire galaxy. The crushing realization hit Kraxos with physical, suffocating force. Humanity hadn't just built a defensive fleet in secret. They had secretly armed every single slave world over 3 long decades of silence. A proximity alarm chirped frantically near the shattered throne. Human boarding pods had already violently breached the flagship's lower decks. 6 standard months later, Terminal Vertex no longer existed as a place of suffering. The heavy iron spires had been completely melted down to slag. Kraxos sat chained tightly to a heavy durasteel bench inside a sterile, windowless holding cell. He stared blankly at a small datapad left intentionally on the cold floor. It displayed live, uninterrupted feeds from the former Ascendancy capital. Trellian laborers and human engineers worked together freely. They were physically tearing down the massive obsidian monuments of his fallen empire. The distant, grinding sound of his empire's structures falling echoed softly from the small speaker. He had ruled the galaxy for a millennium. They had unmade his entire brutal system before a single lunch cycle concluded. The heavy cell door hissed open smoothly. Commander Vance stepped quietly inside the room. She wore the exact same pristine white uniform, unmarked by the devastating galactic war. She didn't speak a single word. She walked deliberately over to the chained, broken tyrant. She reached slowly into her deep uniform pocket. A small object dropped loosely from her bare fingers. It clattered sharply against the metal floor grate. It rolled to a perfect stop against Kraxos's heavy prison boot. The dull, metallic clink filled the heavy silence of the room. The worn copper coin rested motionless in the sterile white light.